Hey, Blau.
Hey, bud, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Perfect.
Great. Well, thank you so much again for making the time. It's very cool to have you on. I imagine you kind of stumbled upon some of my stuff, given your involvement and interest in crypto. I've been fortunate to have a few crypto guests, Vitalik and Roger Ver and some others, Anthony Pompliano, to name a few. And it's one of a number of things I'm really interested in. But as much as possible, I'm trying to make this a generalist podcast, right? So like Rogan, you mentioned earlier, is one of my favorites, and he just kind of has whoever he's interested in talking to on the show. So I'm thrilled to have a musician and a producer that I'm very familiar with from the past. I'm not like the biggest EDM guy in the world, but it's a category of music that I've certainly listened to my fair share of, um, and was very familiar with your stuff. So it's really cool to have you on.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember, I think, I'm trying to think where I initially connected with the podcast. I think Keith tweeted about it. I think that's how I first heard about it.
Yeah, Keith is an awesome investor from my perspective. Obviously, spent a good time operating as well. But I've noticed, like, I was just looking at your Twitter, and obviously you're like a DJ and a producer first and foremost, but you've also, I see the types of people that you're retweeting are like Paul Graham and Naval. You're not like just your everyday DJ who's purely focused on the music. You've got an interesting background, so maybe it'd be best we start there. I've somewhat familiarized myself, but would love to hear for those listening who maybe aren't familiar with your past. Just kind of take us to from the top to where you are today.
Yeah, sure, man. I'll keep it as brief as possible, but I,
But by all means, go into all the details. Just the floor is all yours.
yeah. So, in college, I was surrounded by a lot of people that had a lot of interest in tech. One of my roommates ended up dropping out his sophomore year to go work for Square. He was like one of the earlier, I think probably within employee 50 at Square. Um, and another one of my friends ended up co-founding Open Door with Keith from college, and that's kind of how I know Keith through JD, who I went to college with. I actually played in his frat basement. That was one of my first shows ever when I was like 18 years old. So I was constantly surrounded by tech in college and was always fascinated by it. In many ways, my entire career was built out of, tech and social media, combination of Facebook distribution and SoundCloud. But I was studying finance in college, and I've always had like this combination fascination with music and also with math. A lot of music is mathematical, so it's not a surprise that I kind of have strong interest in both. But in college, I spent a lot of time, assuming that I was going to go work for an investment bank. I ended up getting an offer to go work at BlackRock Asset Management, which was kind of my dream. I loved that aspect of the financial world. And I was also doing music on the side, just as a hobby. What ended up happening though was the music took off virally via YouTube, Facebook, all these other platforms. And all of a sudden there was this demand for me to go to other colleges and play shows on other college campuses. And I would get paid like great chunk of money for being 18, 19 years old at the time to, fly on the weekends to, I remember my first show was was at Georgia Tech University 10 years ago. I made like $750, which was like awesome. I paid for the plane ticket round trip. It was like $200. I stayed in the frat house and like, netted about $500 at the end of the day. And like in college, that's awesome. And it's like a super fun thing to do on the weekends. So that's how it all started. And it escalated pretty quickly to the point where I met my agent, who now works at CAA, but at the time had his own agency in Nashville called PGA. And I met my agent through one of his interns that was just kind of watching what I was doing. And that kind of opened up this whole new world of shows while I was still a junior in college, where I'd literally start leaving every single weekend, and I'd have like 2 shows a weekend. And that's when my grades started to slip. This is, like I said, junior year. So I'd already had this like amazing opportunity at BlackRock and to go kind of intern and then eventually work there. But the music stuff was like too profitable to ignore it. And it kept growing and it grew so quickly that I actually ended up dropping out at the end of my junior year with the endorsement of my economics professor, who was one of my mentors in college. I went to Washington, St. Louis. I don't know if I mentioned that yet, but my economics professor actually convinced my parents to let me leave, because they told me that I could keep my scholarship for 7 years and I could come back whenever if it didn't work out. But my professor felt that like the opportunity cost of me not trying to pursue it full time was too high. He convinced my parents of that. And that's when I moved back home and started touring full time. And it was like a really weird time in life because I had been like so glued to this track of being in finance for a really long time, and twisting that around and moving into the entertainment space was a full 180, but something that was always like a distant dream that became reality. So that all kind of happened when I was 20. And then by the time I was 21, my agent, who I'd met, just through one of his interns who had pitched me, he helped build me up within like the non-college fraternity community and got me real club gigs, at which I performed pretty well, I guess, because they kept booking me. And that's when things started to escalate around 2012 and 2013, when I started playing more festivals and more like major clubs in major cities and building my audience that way. And then fast forward one more year to 2014, when I had a hit song called How You Love Me that went #1 at dance radio. And that kind of like blew the whole thing into the next level. And I became, a little bit more established, and I felt way more secure pursuing a career as a musician full time, financially. So that was a really exciting time. And I think, along the way, there were a lot of points where, obviously my main focus was music, but because I had that financial background, I did spend a lot of time taking care of any capital that I earned and making sure to deploy it in the right places. And I always kind of wanted to be a more financially literate musician than, the stories that you hear of many musicians going bankrupt, spending too much money, not, paying mind to good investment strategy. And I was lucky to have a lot of other smart friends in college who could guide that process. So, that's kind of the beginning of the story, but that's also why I've always followed tech so closely, because I've always felt that, being in the entertainment space, having a pretty decent understanding of what products consumers generally like to interact with, I've always felt that, I've had a pretty good grasp on what platforms will grow and what might fade. The perfect example of that is when Snapchat came out. I was probably one of the first people blowing it up, exploding it. I met the team. I went to their offices in LA really early on. I had like pitched it to all my friends and who were artists, because I felt that there wasn't another platform at the time. At the time, there was no such thing as an Instagram story. And there were like DMs weren't photo DMs. So Snapchat was the first platform that you can interact with fans on a deeper level than you ever could before. And I was using it so much. Like fans would send me Snapchats of shows. I would like put a full show and backstage, clips on my story, and people were going nuts for that stuff. So there's this inherent connection to tech platforms that are entertainment based and music. And I just have always enjoyed the intersection of those two and explored it along the way of my career.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, and you talked about being in college and starting with the weekend gigs, and by junior year, your grades were starting to fall off because you're doing all these weekend shows, but you're making good money, and then you've got this agent. I've certainly heard people's grades falling for a lot less valid reasons, and I think you had, fortunately, that economics professor who was kind of had the foresight to see that you had a very legitimate opportunity, and I'm sure you knew it at the time as well. But I'm sure that was helpful for convincing your parents and whatnot. Looking back now, I hear a lot, like Bezos is a good example. He talks about, because he was working at a hedge fund when he was in his early 30s, I think, and had the idea for Amazon. And he talks about how he went to the park with one of his bosses and he had this idea for the online bookstore. And his boss was like, Jeff, that's a great idea for someone who's not already making, 6 figures and on track to have a great life. Was there some semblance of that for you where like, BlackRock is a very name brand financial firm. Like I started my 2 years out of school in banking myself. So I'm very familiar with, the cutthroat competition. It's not easy to land an internship and then a job at BlackRock. Was there a part of you that was indecisive as well? It's like, this music thing's working, but this is, a calculated risk versus something that seems like a sure thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good perspective. I think you said it really well. It was exactly that. It was a calculated risk of, I have this guaranteed life path, but then I also have this passion that's generating real income. And the point at which I decided to make the switch was actually the point at which it was very, I analyzed it from a very analytical standpoint. It wasn't that emotional. It was when my income from DJing exceeded my first year salary as a first year analyst. That's when I decided it was time to take it more seriously. So it was literally at that point in time where I went to my parents and I was like, guys, I'm making more than 130,000 a year doing this. It was only over a 6-month period and we were already there. And that's when I, told my economics professor, asked him for his advice, told my parents. My parents were reluctant, but luckily enough, I did have a full merit scholarship, so they couldn't really say anything to me because like they weren't paying for it, But I was lucky to, in the moment, in hindsight, it actually feels like it was a bigger risk than in the moment. In the moment, I kind of just knew it was my calling. It was like a gut emotional feeling that I knew I needed to do it. But like I said, the actual decision of when to drop out was a very analytical one. It was, I know that I can survive doing this. And then I also found out that I could go back to school if it didn't work out. So it was like there was almost no risk except for the years that I would spend doing it. But at that point, it was like in such an upward trajectory that I almost didn't feel like it would fail. In hindsight, it was probably a pretty risky decision. But in the moment, it was, oh, I'm making more money than I would otherwise. And this is something that I can, that I enjoy more. And I will say this, I apply my knowledge from the financial world in my music life on a daily basis. In fact, I think that like most musicians have a shorter career because they don't have financial oriented goals. That's not to say that I make music to make money, because I don't, but I think that like it's very easy to get taken advantage of in the music business. And a lot of the time, if you are taken advantage of, it ruins your chances at longevity. So keeping, for instance, like I might be a rare breed in the sense that I've been pretty much independent for my entire career. I've done individual releases with big record labels, but I've never signed a long-term record deal because I didn't want to be locked into, lack of flexibility. As I'm sure everyone's heard who's listening, the stereotypical record label deal that locks you up for a really long time and censors your ability to create. It's pretty accurate for most people. That narrative is probably true. But for me, I just never wanted to go down that path. I wanted to maintain control and maintain equity in all of my work and in my, live show revenue. And I don't think I would have had that perspective if I didn't come from a business background. And at the time, like, when you think of a VC investing in a tech startup, there are a lot of similarities between a record label investing in an artist and a VC investing in a startup. The difference is the record label can take a way more predatory position because they argue that there's higher risk. I actually think the risk is kind of similar. The difference is that with a company can outlive its founders. An artist can't outlive him or herself or themselves. So the VC, the label is kind of stuck with whatever their investment is in that one individual or in that group of individuals, whereas a VC invests in a team and an execution concept that may change over time, and that's okay. It's not like they're losing their value. So in my mind, I had kind of seen what was happening in the tech world from some of my friends, and I was like, all these deals are so unfair. I'm never going to sign these because they're so predatory. And like, what's the purpose of signing a record deal? So that's like kind of another question. There's usually two reasons why an artist does it. Number one, they need the liquidity. They need money up front to be able to pursue their passion. Otherwise, they can't live a healthy lifestyle and live the lifestyle they want to live. So that need for instant liquidity is usually, like historically, why a lot of artists will sign record deals. The second reason is distribution. Historically, record labels have marketing and distribution resources that the an artist couldn't achieve on their own. That's since changed pretty significantly with algorithmic playlisting, with TikTok, with all these different platforms. And so in 2020, record labels are probably less relevant than ever before. And they're hanging on with a thread based on the catalog that they own. So they have all this power because they own the masters of all these like really older, not older, but like even stuff from the 90s and the early 00s. Like they own the rights to those songs that people still want to listen to. So they still kind of maintain this big brother, position in the music world. But I was kind of always of the perspective that I don't have to follow that model. And, a decade later, the fact that I'm still able to perform and my songs are still out there and people are still listening is, I think, proof that it's not, a necessary path that every artist has to take.
Right. And you seem super methodical with all of your thinking, from dropping out to going about being an independent artist. Like you mentioned, these two things, the two aspects that would, lead people to sign a record deal, being the liquidity and the distribution. And yet you kind of, you, like you said, you were making more than you would have made at BlackRock. And so you didn't need the liquidity as desperately as some up and coming artists might. And then
Exactly.
on the distribution side, you realized that you had the power of the internet, which, is somewhat obvious now, even to most still isn't. But back then, like the idea of being an independent artist, distributing on SoundCloud, getting a following on Snapchat, spreading your music on Facebook, that was like super novel and
It
unknown.
wasn't as obvious. Right.
Yeah. And so how much of your career do you think you can attribute to actually your business mind versus obviously you make great music, but like you're putting the pieces together very early, building your brand. And now obviously you're a world famous musician. You mentioned that a lot of artists, like the longevity falls short because they don't have the kind of fiscal literacy or whatever it might be. But like, could you have even made it to where you are in the first place, do you think?
So I think that being a musician is very similar to anything else in life, and it requires two skill sets. Number one is the actual left brain creativity, which without it, you can only go so far. There have been a lot of musicians that like have no left brain creativity, pay off a lot of other people to do their shit for them and still build a brand. But even those artists, they still have to have like the creative vision for their own identity, and they have to know what consumers are going to relate to. So even if they're not good at making music, a lot of people can get away with just coming up with a powerful brand and pushing that out to the world and seeing success. But as a creative, if your goal is to make music and for that creativity to resonate, you kind of do need to have this base level of, you got to kind of be good, right? You kind of have to be good at making music, or you can pay someone who you think is good to make it for you, which a lot of people do. But those are kind of the two necessary variables in being a successful musician. The other side of it is, either your team or your own work ethic, or the combination of both, where, in 2020 or even 5 years ago, there are so many variables in like what makes a successful musical career. And it depends on the type of really depends on how many dependencies you have as a musician. So like a singer who can't produce the beats is dependent on finding people to produce the beats, right? I myself, because I just produce beats, I also sing and write lyrics, but I haven't really sang on too much of my own stuff yet. I'm forced to find, to rely on that dependency of finding good vocalists. Thankfully, there are way more good vocalists out there than there are good producers. So if you're a singer, it's actually way more difficult to make it than if you're a good producer. A good producer can also get paid to do stuff for other artists pretty frequently, even if they're not working on their own career. So it's like way more monetizable to be good at the science than it is to just have a good voice, probably because it's a more scarce skill set. So yeah, I think number one, you actually have to be good. But number two, you have to every artist is a startup. You have to assemble a team of people that can execute lots of different strategies while you're staying creative, because you can't separate your mind all the time into the marketing and into actually making the records. You have to have a team of people that you trust to execute on your behalf and to execute within your vision. And I think that's really hard. I think that's like the biggest challenge in kicking off a career. And for me, when I was younger, like now I don't have to be as crazy on the marketing side because I'm happy where I am in my space in the universe as an artist. Like I wouldn't necessarily care if I became any bigger than I am, per se. I care a lot more that my music resonates with people because I'm at that point in my life. But at the time when I was younger, I was relentless. Like I would, like you said, it was the early days of Facebook and SoundCloud. Facebook didn't have a limiter on their distribution, right? Like if you liked my page, you were seeing my shit, and that was great. To being able to take advantage of that was so powerful at the time because the impressions, the pure impressions were extensive, and I would just like wake up in the morning. At night, I'd work on my music from like 8 to 3 a.m. And then in the morning, I'd be on email with every major blog and like try to get whatever distribution I could myself without signing the label deal and like leaving it up to them, which is what a lot of artists do. They'll sign the deal, they'll send the music in, and then they won't worry about the marketing. They'll just assume the label will take care of it. In my case, I was like, fuck it. I'm literally going to reach out to everyone, establish a personal relationship and connection with people, hopefully get them to like what I have to say with my music and get them to believe in me and believe in my story. And it's hard to do that when you're doing it through someone else. So that was my perspective early on, is I just needed to like go. And I felt like there was this opportunity where there weren't that many US based DJs. Dance music was just starting to grow in America. It was obviously big in Europe already, but like Avicii was just getting popular at the time. And I saw this huge void for an American DJ. It was really just Skrillex at the time and Cascade and Diplo. And that was it. There was no one else. So I just tried to spearhead my way into that space early on, which in hindsight was a really good decision because now, of course, everyone wants to be a DJ. But at the time, it was still early.
It's funny you talk about kind of your day to day in that time, and I don't want to botch it, but I think I know it was Paul Graham's essay. I forget what it was called exactly. I think it's makers versus manager schedule or something like that. And it's basically about how different schedules look between someone who's busy making and someone who's busy managing. And it sounds like, and he talks about how, for someone who needs to do both, like a founder CEO type who wants to still be driving the vision, but also has a lot to manage, it can be beneficial to kind of split either your days or your weeks or whatever it might be into like these different segments where in one part you might have this back to back to back busy work. Not that it's not real work, but it's like business type stuff. And then you set aside large blocks of time for the creative work. And it sounds like you spent a lot of time, maybe consciously or not, devoting your evenings and like working till 3 a.m. kind of like a madman, I assume, to produce the best possible creative that you could in terms of music, which was your outlet. And then at the same time, you're waking up and working like a business person, kind of getting this stuff out and making sure it gets eyeballs.
Exactly. And what's funny is I've gotten worse at it over time because I'm going to bed earlier and earlier. So my creative time has been crunched a little bit more. So I'm actually like more lately, I'm forced to adjust a little bit because I don't have the stamina as I did 10 years ago. Not that I'm that old. I'm going to be 30 in 4 months, but I still definitely don't have the stamina that I did when I was 21. So it's an adjustment. And I think you're right. Like I'm constantly learning how to block my time better. Even like this podcast is a call that's more entertaining for me within, I have a family thing after it, but then I had like 3 other calls before it. I try to block all that time close together so that like after 5 or 6 o'clock, I can focus on music stuff. But then some days that doesn't always work out, unfortunately, especially because in this environment, there's like so much is changing in my industry. I think that this is not to be like, woe is me, because by no means do I mean that. But I do think that music industry is probably one of the harshest, has suffered one of the more harsher impacts from COVID, just given the fact that like, it's the one thing that isn't really televised as much and that requires a lot of people to be in a small space together. Like sports can still be televised, right, without the audience, and it's still interesting. But music is probably not as interesting when you just watch it. This has been kind of seen as like these digital concerts were super popular in the beginning of COVID, and there's been this massive fall off of viewership because it's just not interesting. So people want to be there. They don't necessarily care to watch it. So yeah, I think like there, it's been a really interesting 6 months since COVID hit, because the music industry was just rocked, and it's kind of forcing everyone to rethink how they approach their monetization mechanics as artists, but also like it's been a little bit difficult to be creative because I just haven't necessarily been inspired given the circumstances. And so it's tricky. I think a lot of other artists are struggling with that. I am as well. And so it's like sometimes podcasts like this where I can vocalize my thoughts are helpful, like help release this like tension in my brain of worry, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to help, play a part in inspiration any way I can. It's awesome talking with you. I want to talk about, you obviously mentioned COVID has shifted the landscape to some extent. And I think in a lot of industries, it's accelerated their track to the future. But what's underappreciated is that, like, the fact that people can't be within 6 feet of each other, and all of the virus specific related changes are not natural. Like, yes, we might have been headed towards more of a remote work culture, but not one where people can't go into the office 2 or 3 days a week if they want to, or whatever it might be. And I don't know if that's affecting music as well. Like, the obvious would be that there's no live events, and like, yes, music might have gone more digital, but there would have continued to be concerts. Um, More broadly than COVID, even, and I want to get into crypto at some point, and it might be involved to some degree in your answer to this, but would love to hear your perspective on like the next 10 years, call it the 2020s, for the music industry, and how things from your perspective are set to kind of evolve.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that the music industry is like you said, there are a lot of other industries that are adapting pretty well to this digital culture. Music is inherently, something that's a collective experience, and Spotify's kind of already revolutionized the way we consume music digitally. There aren't too many new ways that can manifest outside, like from a pure consumption of music standpoint. Like streaming is probably the end all in that regard, but I do think there are deeper ways that fans can connect with music, which is something that I'm exploring via distributed ledger tech, and we'll dive into that in a second. But so much of music is collective experience in real life, and so it's like really difficult. I don't think there has been that much headway within the music industry of like new ideas that adapt to COVID. I mean, I've heard a lot of them, but I don't believe in a lot of them, right? Like people are trying to create the Netflix of concerts, which I like don't think is interesting at all. People are trying to, do these drive-in shows, which is basically a diluted experience that people are paying the same price for. So it's not even something that we're really exploring, because we feel that why give fans a half-ass show when we can just wait till this is over.
What about, while you're on the subject, like VR? Is that something that you've talked about at all?
So I actually, funny enough, like I did a call yesterday with a guy that created this, like basically VR world on Ethereum, and it's fucking awesome. Like it works, and it's like crazy how it already works pretty well. I still think there's like a pretty big barrier to entry for a lot of people in VR. But I do think that in the future, VR concerts will be more popular. I just don't know if it's like, I think it's over a longer period time horizon. I don't think it's like a next 2 year thing. I think it's a next 5 to 10 year thing, personally. So while we're exploring it, there's just nothing that compares to that personal connection at a show. And so yeah, so I guess kind of jumping off of that to the next part, what I was going to mention is, I've just been exploring ways to add a layer of consumption of the art that I create. So in the past, I guess what I mean by that is, in the past, there's only been like 2 ways that most people can interact, or 3 ways that most people can interact with an artist that they like. One, on social media, right? Like following their lives, interacting with them over, social platforms like Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, whatever. That's one way to interact, but it's actually a very shallow form of interaction. They're usually very quick interactions, and usually the fan follows you, and then it's a passive kind of consumption where like you'll be on a TikTok feed or an Instagram feed, and you'll scroll past one of your favorite artists' posts, and you'll like consume it, and then you'll move on. It's not like you're actively seeking to engage on a social platform with a musician. unless you're like a super fan following Bieber, but like, those do exist. But like in general, the deepest way to connect with a musician is by listening to their music more so than, following them on social media. So even for me, like I have a lot of favorite artists that I don't even follow on social media. It's like a secondary thought, right? The reason why I love certain artists is because of the music that they make more than, their daily activities and their like viral shit that they create on TikTok, right? So the first layer of interacting with an artist has been, social identity layer, which is interesting, but like not a way to create a deeper connection with a fan.
And it's not like music specific, right?
Exactly. It's more identity specific. It's not music specific. So there are a lot of artists that like have these huge online identities, but like their music is probably more, and it's all opinion, it's all subjective, right? But I do think that there's certain artists, the deeper of a connection you can create with a fan, the longer your career. Whereas like Old Town Road is a great example of an internet viral song. I don't know in 3 years how many people are going to be looking for the next little Nas X song and be so excited about it coming out. Because I mean, this is the typical problem of a one-hit wonder mentality, right? A lot of artists like try to create that one hit, and they get stuck in this problem of like their social identity is way bigger than their connection with fans across their music. So yeah, I guess there's this one layer which is social for a musician. The other layer is the music itself that people listen to and on a regular basis. If somebody chooses to listen to something, it's 10 times more powerful than if they come across it in a playlist and they like it. If someone actively goes and listens to something, they generally like listen to it a lot more and keep going back to it than if they just hear it on a playlist and like check it off and like it. And then there's the occasional conversion where they hear it on the playlist and they like it so much that they keep listening to it. But that happens sometimes, but it doesn't happen that often. So like relatively speaking to the whole listening experience, right? That is how most people discover music these days. But you might like find 10 things that you like, but you're probably only going to go back to 1 or 2 of those 10 things based on what you like the most. So yeah, the music itself is kind of that second layer of connection. And the third layer of connection is the live show, which doesn't exist. So I've kind of been exploring this fourth layer, this like fourth dimension, so to speak, of connecting with a fan base. And Tim Westergren, who the ex-CEO of Pandora, and I had a conversation about this a couple years ago when I started to get more active in the blockchain space. And we were talking about how there's no way to measure the emotional value that a song creates for one fan, not for like a lot of fans, but social metrics and followers online on social media don't at all measure the depth of connection that an artist has with their loyal fan base. The perfect example of this is an artist that you might know, whether you listen to electronic music or not, Rufus Du Sol, headlining Coachella, one of the biggest electronic artists of our generation. They only have 3 million monthly listeners on Spotify and like less than a couple 100,000 followers on Instagram. Yet the connection their fans have with them is so strong. That's why they're headlining Coachella, right? So, it's there's this kind of immeasurable value creation from music that hasn't, like, there's been no way to capture that value. And Tim Westergren said this to me, and it like really resonated. He was like, in all my years at Pandora, I still didn't figure out a way to like capture all this emotional value that a song creates for a person. And like so many of my songs have been used. People walk down the aisle to the acoustic version of one of my songs, How You Love Me, which was my big hit in 2014. So many people walk down the aisle to that acoustic version of the song. What's the value in that? Like, they're doing it for free, but what value do they actually feel from doing that? It hasn't really been capturable in the past. So one of the things I've been exploring is like, how do you let the public invest in you as an artist? It's not really something that's been accessible in the past. It also hasn't been profitable in the past. So if you looked at music cash flows 5 years ago without streaming, they'd be pretty low. Not many people were buying music. Also, not many people were paying for streaming memberships. Now there's this huge influx of capital that's going to not as much artists, more so record labels, right? Because record labels have signed these really predatory deals with artists. And there's this false narrative that artists don't get paid by Spotify. It's simply not true. It's just that the artists sign bad deals, and a larger percentage of that is going to the label and not to the artist. This is like an angle that no one ever really talks about. But in my case, I've seen like 50x revenue growth in my like royalties in the past 3 to 5 years, just because more people are paying for streaming services and I own a lot of my rights. So I said to myself, well, music assets are things that like humans have a real emotional connection to, but have never been able to invest in. Like, but they also produce similar returns to real estate returns. Like there's no depreciation factor, but like you invest in a building, it produces rent, which is a cash flow. And eventually you may sell that building and, 1031 it to another building, or, take the profit, pay capital gains, whatever. And it's been a tried and true way to invest in a public need. Right now, the only investors or at least in the past like decade, the primary investor in music is record labels. Now there's like other tools like royalty exchange and other products that enable like regular people to invest in song royalties, but it hasn't really been normalized yet. And it hasn't been like pitched to the public in a way that they understand. So people are like stuck investing on Robinhood and equities that they don't understand. But why not give them the ability to invest in an artist that they love? And then, in turn, if they invest as little as $10 in an artist's music that they actually could earn cash flows from, they're even more incentivized to distribute it to their network. So it creates this positive feedback loop. This is something that I've been exploring pretty extensively. Like, how do we enable like the public to access music asset investments? It's never been done. So the first like kind of obvious answer to that is via distributed ledger technology. And that's just because it's actually the most efficient way to distribute royalties to fans. It's also an easy way to like provide micropayments and incentives to fans to do things, bounties, stuff like that. So it's something that I've been exploring for like 3-4 years. The issue has been the regulatory environment is so uncertain, and investing in a song is definitely a security. There's an expected cash flow outcome. So it's not like, very clear utility. And for those who are familiar with some historical blockchain world terms, there, when all these projects started popping out of the earth, no one even talked about them being securities. They were always just, oh, this is a utility. This is a utility, meaning that you actually gain something emotional out of, or something beneficial out of investing in these products, these protocols. The SEC very quickly threw down their hammer and said, a lot of these are probably securities because there's this expectation of return or speculation, and these products actually don't even do anything yet. And they're probably right. A lot of these, protocols and tokens don't do anything yet that's rational or reasonable in the real world. So the idea of investing in a song via token is probably a security, which adds this whole layer of cost. When you think about tokenizing a song, there's like extensive legal costs in doing that. So one of the things that I've like to be really specific, what I'm exploring is how do we create the safe for equity, like the safe and equity investments, which is like an industry standard now. How do we create that for investing in a song so that there aren't like these legal barriers to an artist being able to raise their own capital? Basically fulfilling that role that a record label has, like providing liquidity. Why shouldn't a fan be able to access that liquidity from their fan base? Like that, this is something that I think is extremely interesting and could like totally take the music industry into a new, evolutionary state. And the reason why I think this is so relevant is because of this great statistic that came out in Rolling Stone a couple of years ago, that of the $40 billion recorded music business, only 12% ends up in the artist's hands. So there's 88% of that $40 billion industry that can be disrupted by literally cutting out middlemen that are probably irrelevant. And so I've been spending a lot of time exploring that. I think it's a way longer exploration. It's going to take some time, but I am going to issue equity in my next album to fans. And I'm thankful to have a friend who has the legal resources to do it without charging me a shit ton of money, because it would be so expensive if I were to do it on my own. So we're going to do an interesting experiment and see how much demand there is for investing in my future album. And we're also going to show fans, statistics on how the last album performed, which, to give you an idea, I came out with an album in 2018 and it's already generated over 750,000 in total revenue in 2 years. So like the valuations of these albums could be pretty high for an artist who wants to raise capital. And I'm like of the smaller league. Like I have 2 million monthly listeners. There are a lot of artists with 10 million monthly listeners. So there's this whole movement towards this trend. It's just there haven't been any tools that exist
especially tools that artists and managers understand, because it's a very like tech oriented mindset that I take when I approach this stuff. But I'm definitely down to be an experiment and see how it goes. So far, there's been like all my tech friends are like super interested in investing in this, and like it's probably the money that we want to raise is probably like already all committed for because it's an interesting experiment. The question is, if we do it successfully, will other artists want to try it? And I think at that point, it's really powerful. But so that's kind of like my long-term vision for music and how I like want to be a part of the story and how the music industry is disrupted. It's something that I like spend a lot of time thinking about every day. But the short-term vision is more, like I was saying, this like fourth layer of capturing value. Obviously, like fans investing in a song enables them to like capture value with the artist, incentivizes all parties to promote it, and it creates like a more emotional connection for a fan to a song that they might already demand or want. And so one of the things that I've been doing in the short term to prove this model is the NFT space, or the non-fungible token / digital art world. So only in the past 3 months, my art director and I have been making these audio-visual loops and selling limited editions of them on Ethereum. And the demand has been absolutely insane for fans to actually have this deeper connection to a song than just a stream. They actually own it. They own this piece of art that exists on the internet. And it's something that's like really hard to wrap your head around. But we've done, I mean, in the past 3 months, my art director and I have done $78,000 in digital art sales. Or not 3 months, sorry, 35 days. We've done $78,000 in digital art sales. So it's like, there's demand for this stuff. There's demand for fans to have a deeper connection to the art that they consume. It's just, it hasn't manifested yet in any particular way. So these are kind of like, those are the two things I'm exploring, and I could talk about them for another like 5 hours, but I'm kind of exploring, number one, like giving the public access to investing in music assets. I think that's super interesting. I think doing that via distributed ledger tech is probably the most efficient way of doing it as well, especially from a royalty distribution standpoint. And two, I've been exploring this concept of like scarce media, because we've always been trained that like media should reach the most amount of people, instead of thinking that media can be exclusive and owned by a select few. And it's actually how like music always used to be experienced in the olden days. Like, it's not like Mozart did a massive concert for the whole population. Like, he would get hired to do small recitals in like private homes who could afford his performance. I think that NFTs are just like the digital form of that. It gives people a unique experience that they're excited about because they're so connected to the artist that's creating the art. So yeah, I mean, I'm like super stoked about all this stuff. I could talk about it for ages, but it's a fun sandbox to play in.
I love the vision and the concept, everything you're talking about. I'm not in the music industry directly, but like I find myself almost inspired by all of these different angles you're taking to try to monetize the industry, and not for the purpose of just making money, but you want to spread your art to as many people as possible. You want to be able to focus on creating the best music that you can, and whether that means monetizing, by selling a piece of, an NFT, a piece of visual art with some music behind it to one person, and monetizing that way to enable you to keep doing what you do, or giving people a share in your album so that a bunch of people can collectively kind of support the artist that makes them, gives them that emotional value that you talked about. There's a lot to unpack there, and I definitely need to listen back to it again to kind of process some of it. But it's obvious that you've been thinking about all of this quite a bit, and I'm excited. I think that, to me, like I had heard of you as an artist before. I didn't know that there was this other side of you. I didn't even know that.
Everyone says that in every conversation. They're like, "Oh, this is a DJ who DJ like does tech stuff. Like what?" And everyone's always so surprised. I love hearing you say it, because I love hearing everyone say it. I think I kind of have an uphill battle as an entrepreneur, because there's this like predisposition that I'm like just some DJ. But
you get pigeonholed, right? And I think it's like one of the worst things is like, you ever read an article about someone, regardless of like who they are, what they did. Like you mentioned Lil Nas X earlier, and like the poor guy for the rest of his life is going to be the guy, the artist behind Old Town Road, or the rapper behind Old Town Road. And there's like no escaping that. Or like Macaulay Culkin's always the Home Alone kid. And more broadly than that, you're to most people a DJ or a producer or a musician more broadly, but I actually think that there's enough, like, who am I to say, but I think that the track, you're so young, the track that you're on, I could see you becoming better known for the way you kind of revolutionize the industry and um, bring together finance and tech and music, and with crypto kind of being the underlying theme as well. I'm just excited to see what happens, because it sounds like all of these skills that you have and this interest across a number of different um, you know a number of different large, super impactful spaces is going to come together. And I think it's going to be interesting. And obviously you're connected with other artists and other people in tech. And I'm just excited to see what happens. So,
I appreciate that, man. I really appreciate that.
yeah, I know we're coming up on time, and I'm excited. Never done this before on the podcast, but we're going to have some music from you following this conversation. I hope we can do a part two at some point. We certainly could talk for a lot longer, and it sounds like you could certainly share a lot more about your vision, and I'm sure we'll do so elsewhere as well. But last question for you. Sure. On the music front specifically, how do you see yourself evolving? You talked about the industry, but how do you see yourself evolving on the music front? You obviously started as more of a mashup kind of fraternity party DJ, developed into a producer with no dependencies, like you said, a lot of creative liberties and freedom to kind of do what you want. You mentioned that I heard that you played a lot of instruments growing up. You mentioned that you sing a bit. Do you see your music evolving as well as you get older?
Yeah, I think, I made a lot of sacrifices early on creatively, to try to reach that widespread distribution. Like, I didn't take as many creative risks that I wanted to, because I wanted to be able to sustain a certain lifestyle making music, which was like always really important to me. I didn't want to get stuck like not having something else to fall back on after music if I took too many risks, which is like you had mentioned earlier, like maybe an overly rational perspective towards something that's creative, but it's inevitable. It's in my blood. Like, try to stay super logical and rational about everything, even though I love being creative. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that my music will evolve. I am singing on a couple records that are coming out, which is like super exciting. I've never had the balls to do it in the past. And because of COVID hitting at the time that it did, it was actually like right around my decade anniversary of touring. I'm 29 now. I started touring when I was 19. I stopped touring this year in March. And after 10 years of kind of doing the same thing, I definitely took like 3 months of a break. I kind of like didn't do much, just, relaxed and kind of tried to figure out what my next purpose was. Not that I'll ever stop making music, but I do think that every artist, when you've done one type of sound in the past, you don't want to necessarily do it again, because you've already been there. You've already expressed that feeling. You've already achieved that musical goal. So I haven't necessarily known what my next musical goal is yet, to be honest. But I think I'm spending most of my time exploring those two kind of ideas of digital art and public access to music assets. And in the past 3 months, like, that's actually been taking up a lot of my brain space, because music is so important. It's so important with music that you actually tour off of it and give people a live setting to listen to it, at least for the type of music that I make. Like, the live component is so important. But I haven't been thinking too much about the music that I'm making. And I've been thinking a lot more about these disruptive business ideas. That being said, I think a big part of that is because I just haven't been inspired. But that's starting to shift in the past couple of weeks as I've seen some of this digital art perform really well. I'm more and more excited to make, to push the musical boundaries a little bit, because I have the time to now, versus in the past when my studio time was pretty limited because I was always on tour. So musically, I don't have an answer right now on like what I'm going to pursue next. I know I'm like experimenting with a lot of different ideas internally, but I think, I'll definitely start singing on stuff, which is exciting for fans to hear that voice. I'm also like making like some like super techie underground stuff, because I've always wanted to, and like, why not? In the past, most artists are constantly chasing the next show, chasing the tickets, chasing the relevance. And COVID kind of like just brought this like great positive reality to me that like, I don't have to chase anymore. I've done this for 10 years. I don't have to like, my fans aren't going to not listen if I take 3 months off, if I take a year off. They've established this strong connection to me that when I do come back with something different, hopefully they're still going to love it. But it was hard for me to gain that perspective without COVID. I was constantly chasing relevance. I think most artists do. So yeah, I think I'm like kind of still in the stages of figuring out what's next musically, but I think people are going to enjoy it because it's definitely going to be from a deeper place when it comes out.
Appreciate the transparency there. And I do want to mention, like you say that you haven't been inspired lately with everything going on, but you know, outside looking in, it seems like while you might not be inspired totally in the musical direction and evolving that, you certainly seem inspired on the business front, and it takes just as much I mean, not just as much. I don't want to downplay anything, but it takes creativity to rethink an industry. It might just be a little bit more left brain than some of the stuff you've become famous for in the past. But I think it's awesome, and I'm looking forward to seeing how it all evolves. So with that, I'm going to wrap up here. I want to give you the last word to tell people where to follow you or find you online and everything like that. But after you do that, rather than going into my typical outro music, we'll go into some music by you.
Awesome. We'll do a little chill mix, not something too heavy for the listeners. And thanks so much for having me, man. This was awesome.
Welcome. You just stepped into Blau's house. Get ready for the ride.
In your direction, come a little closer to me. I need your information. I'm not leaving here without you. Oh baby, I've been thinking about you, and maybe you've been thinking about me. Oh baby, I've been waiting for you, and lately it's been on my mind. my head. I think I'm losing touch, thinking about you too much. It's like you've got that kiss of death. Because in you I could drown it. They can't pull me out. Cause if you were the sea, I would dive deep and I wouldn't even need to breathe. Feet up off the ground, we keep going round. It was never gonna be, never gonna be, never gonna be enough for me. Because you keep me up, keep me up at night. Won't you come, keep me up, keep me up tonight. Because you keep me up, keep me up at night. Won't you come, keep me up tonight. Won't you keep me up tonight? Won't you keep me up tonight? Won't you keep me up tonight? Keep me up tonight. Won't you come? Keep me up tonight. Won't you keep me up? I never fake a feel. There's no mistake, it's real. One look at you and I get struck. We lay above the clouds, then we come raining down. It's like it's lightning when we touch. Because in you I could drown it. They can't pull me out. If you were the sea, I would dive deep and I wouldn't even need to breathe. Feet up off the ground, we keep going round. It was never gonna be, never gonna be, never gonna be enough for me. Because you keep me up, 7 days, dead air, empty space. Is this where we are now? Would call, but I don't. You could, but you won't. 'Cause it's been too long now. I know that it happens. People, they go apart, but I never imagined it happened to us. 'Cause I knew you so well, better than myself. But everything's changed now. Do you feel it? Drifting slowly down. Do you feel it? Do you feel it? All this distance I've been reaching out. Do you feel it? Do you feel the way we're falling out of time? Long days, busy lives, just can't find the time. Keep making excuses. Wouldn't call, but I don't. You could, but you